Today on Cryptic Mass Guitar, we do a high gain off between the version 2 of the Paul Reed Smith Archon 50 and the version 1 of the EVH 5150iii 50-watt 6L6 head. I'm still doing the DADGAD tuning because I did get a little addicted to the stuff that Monuments and John Brown were doing. Now let's go ahead and chew that really cheap intro that took me about 5 minutes to make. Now, what is a high gain off? I'll flash it on the screen while I explain it. It's 4 different scenarios. Scenario 1 is both amps going through 4 different cabinets with 4 different speaker types in them. Scenario 2 is 3 different sound samples. 2 of them have leads built in. The first one is TS9 boosted, second one is not, and then the third one is somewhat matching speaker types for that head. I'll explain it when I get to it. And then scenario 3 is both amps blended together, so the Archon hard panned left and the 5150iii hard panned right. And scenario 4 is both amps with similar settings built to them. So let's start out with scenario 1 with the 4 different cabinets and 4 different speaker types. You'll be able to hear right away that both of these amps are very, very different in their gain structure and with their EQ. On to scenario 2. This is what I used to just call a high gain shootout. So it's just A being the amps with the same riffs and stuff like that. I try to keep which amp is being used on the screen because some people can't tell when you switch. So the first one, TS9 boosted with a KH95 wah. Second one, no wah, no boost. And the third one, I tried to do matching speaker types, or cabinets and speaker types. I have the 5150iii cabinet, the 4x12, that actually has the G12 EVH speakers built in. Those are Heritage Greenbacks. So they say they're 25 watts, but they're actually 30 watts. But when it comes to the Archon 50, I did this a little weird because I don't have the V-type speaker that it's set, like that it's made for. But the V-type is technically in between a V30 and a Greenback. So hard pan left is a vintage 30 and hard pan right is a Greenback. On to scenario 3 here. This is where I blend both amps together. So hard pan left is the Archon 50, hard pan right is the 5153. Throughout this high gain off so far, you might have been able to hear that the Archon 50 doesn't have as much gain as the 5153. The 5153 is easily saturated versus the Archon 50, which is not. Also, the Archon 50 is more mid-focus with not much focus on the low end or the high end, whereas the 5153, almost the opposite. A lot of people will say that it sounds scooped. I don't think that's really the right way of putting it, but I can understand that. Blending both of these together, this is where you might be thinking of a live scenario. So, in a live scenario, the amp that has more mid-focus to it generally will cut through a lot more. You'll be able to hear it. I will let you know that for this, I had to decrease the volume in post on the Archon 50 and increase the volume in post on the 5153 because you heard the Archon 50 very, very easily, whereas the 5153 sort of disappeared in the mix. So I had to actually, again, decrease the volume on the Archon 50 and increase the volume on the 5153. So here's what it sounds like. Now, finally on to scenario 4, where I do similar settings with both amps. I'm doing things a little different. I'm not using channel 2 whatsoever on the 5153. There's nothing with channel 2 here in this high gain off, which is a little unfortunate, but just for simplicity's sake, I didn't want to keep, bouncing back and forth between channel 2 and channel 3. But you're going to hear I'm using the same setting like basically twice, and then I'm switching. So you'll hear the Archon 50 with the same riff and the same settings twice cycled, but I'm turning the bright switch off and then turning it on. So the 5153 will have 2 where there's no differences whatsoever, but here, the Archon 50, I'm turning the bright switch off and bright switch on. I am still somewhat forced to decrease the volume in post on the Archon 50 and increasing the volume ever so slightly on the 5153. Not as much as when I'm in scenario 3 when I was blending them, but just very, very little. And it is still evident when you go from amp to amp where there's a difference. You will probably be able to hear a ton of low end and high end when it comes to the 5153, whereas the Archon 50, it's a little more balanced on the mid area. However, it is still something that would, peek through or cut through a little more in a live scenario. All right, so there are all of the 4 different scenarios for the high gain off. So it's at this point in the video I'd like to talk about my thoughts on both of these amps. And I do kind of want to reiterate a few things here. I'll start off with the 5153. So some people may think that it is, criminal that I did not use channel 2 whatsoever. I made sure to keep using channel 3. There's a lot more gain built in on channel 3. However, some people do use channel 2 and use channel 3 just for leads, which I can definitely understand. Channel 2 is no slouch, but for this one here, I went with what I would go with. So I do use channel 3 as my high gain channel when it comes to like channel 2. That's something where I like to keep that with the gain dialed back a little more, especially on the Stealth that I own. Kind of gives it that like multi-channel flavor rather than, using channel 3 is just sort of like a boost for a lead. So yes, I do understand it is criminal that I did not use channel 2 if you think so. Also, the resonance control on the back, it's really hard to show that, where I have it. So what a lot of people continuously tell me since I got the Stealth is the OG 5150 so the 100-watt version of this, which did not have a resonance control, that was internally set to about 6. So that's where I kept it. So sitting right around like 12:30 or 1 o'clock. I did not want to continuously change that. Now, the Archon 50 has its own presence and depth control. The depth control would be considered like a resonance control. And I was changing that around just because there's more benefit. And it's easier to get actually different sounds out of the Archon 50 in a high gain scenario if you're actually, putting a little more control on the depth, if that's the way to say it. The Archon 50 also gets a really bad rap. People hate this amp. I really don't understand why. If you're a guitar player that only has 1 amp head, I know only has 1 amp head. Most people just have 1 amp head. But if you're a guitar player that has 1 amp head, I can understand steering clear of the Archon 50. But if you're a guitar player that has 1 amp head and you're looking for a second one, this might be the go-to for you. Because you can get it for a really good price on the used market and a somewhat fair price new. But the fact that the Archon 50 is more mid-focused, where a lot of people may have, like a Mesa, an EVH, or like a Marshall DSL, which is not your typical Marshall. It's sort of like a Marshall Mesa mix, if you will. This is going to pair really well with it. Also, if you're in a live scenario, like I said earlier, and your other guitar player has a 5153 or a Mesa or something like that, use this. And you'll hear yourself a lot more than over the Mesa. It's just something that cuts through a little more just because of the way that the EQ is set up and the EQ kind of works. It is, however, not an amp that gets highly saturated, which, in a 1v1 scenario, yeah, a lot of times it's a lot more pleasing to have, like to the player, to have a more saturated sound. However, in the overall spectrum, when you're playing in a live scenario, that saturation can get lost. And you'll be able to be heard a lot more with this. The EQ is very weird. You can't step around that. When you're bringing up the volume control, which is actually the gain control, once you bring that past noon, it starts to get fuzzy. And like the MT100 does that as well. It's not gain like most other amps. It starts to actually sound like it's sort of like a fuzz pedal at that point. And when it comes to the bright switch, the only other amp that I like to have the bright switch on is a Mark V. And I don't know what that is, but it's just something a little magical with a Mark V that I like to keep the bright switch on. But this is the only other amp, even like a Mark IV, I don't usually have the bright switch on. But this is the only other amp where I knowingly keep that bright switch on because this is a very dark amp. A lot of people will say that presence control, if the bright switch is down, that presence control needs to be at like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. That's really crazy. Most presence controls on other amps that I usually keep at noon, sometimes even at like 10 or 11, sometimes at 1 o'clock. But you do generally have to have that presence up a lot higher. When you're incorporating the bright switch, you can start to bring that presence down, and there just seems to be a lot more control over the high end for it. Now, raising the volume on the Archon 50, it's, how do I put this where people aren't going to say, oh, it's like a solid state amp. It doesn't liven up the EQ as much as other amps. So generally, like if you're playing a tube amp at bedroom levels, that volume's going to be down, and because that volume's down, the amp doesn't liven up, it doesn't breathe as much, so you start to skew your EQ a lot more. So your high end and your mids are going to be up a lot more than if you're playing it louder. When you start to increase the volume on most other amps, then your treble and your middle and your bass is going to be brought down quite a bit. But that's where a lot of people get confused, like, hey, how come, like the amp controls are almost at noon on this video that I'm watching, and when I play it, I have to have everything skewed in order for it to sound like that. It's because those people are playing at bedroom levels, whereas the ones where the EQ is kind of more in the middle, they're playing at louder volumes. Most likely like me, where they have the amps in a different room and that room is treated. But with the Archon 50, when you're increasing that, the Maestr, the EQ doesn't liven up as much. It definitely does, but like it's not, it livens up, but not like most other amps. So you're still going to be skewing your EQ controls, and sometimes it'll be a little all over the place. What I find with the Archon 50 is I'll play, and I like to have, things very loud, and I like to be able to feel the guitar from the other room with the walls shaking. But I'll get a sound that I like, and from that point on, before I record, I generally go, okay, I'm going to turn the bass down just a little bit. So I'll get rid of a little bit of that low end, and then at that point, so I'll get a sound that I really, really like, and then I'll dial the bass down a little. And that translates in a recording scenario a little better. So just to reiterate here, the Archon 50 live scenario, you'll cut through more. Just with everything else that's going on sonically, with the bass, the vocals, the drums, and stuff like that, the way that the EQ is set up here, where it's more mid-focused, not a lot of low or high-focused, it'll cut through a lot more. So you'll be able to hear it over a 5153, even if you're increasing the volume on the 5153. Not always the case. There's different ways that you can EQ things, and there's a lot more balance in that, but generally you're going to hear yourself more with an Archon 50. Doesn't get as saturated as the 5153, and there's a lot more variance in the EQ controls on the 5153. So in a 1v1 scenario, most people will be more happy with the 5153, just again because there's a lot more variance in the tone and easily saturated. It's hard to take a lot of that saturation out on channel 3 for the EVH 5153 as well. The other thing to note here, the Archon 50, I find myself like in a real life scenario for recording, because that's what I do, record. I find myself mixing cabinets more often, so left and right. I used to think that, like, if I'm doing that, like a custom 90 speaker mixed with a G12 75T, that was like this magical pairing, because you have the low end and the high end focus, low end and low mid focus of the custom 90, and the high end focus with that fat girth on the G12 75T. G12T75, whatever. But in doing this recording here, trying to get that fake V-type scenario, which makes no sense, pairing the Vintage 30 with the Heritage Greenbacks and the G12 EVHs, that balance there was really, really nice. Whereas most often I find the G12 EVHs, the Heritage Greenbacks, those ones they have this weird mid focus to them, to where like it's sort of got that ping pong-y type sound, if that makes any sense. But blending that with a V30 just worked really well. And the Archon 50 is one of those amps that I find just sounds best when you're blending different speaker types. But that is all I have to say when it comes to both of these amps. They're both great choices. I find that, again, if you're going to be buying one amp and sticking with one amp, probably go with the 5153. It's just a really good choice. But if you're definitely going to be in a live scenario, you want to cut through, or you want that second amp so you can do blended amp type recordings, Archon 50. On the used market, because people are confused over it and the EQs are very weird, you can get it for a decent price. And if you got to the end of this video, I appreciate it, because really I hate listening to me talk. It's just really annoying, so thanks for that. And I'm not sure how long I'll be doing the DADGAD tuning. It's just something, when I change things up on guitar, I tend to, focus on that quite a bit. And I, tend to, even though I think my riffs always sound the same, just a little bit of variance here and there, I don't know, I'm having fun with the DADGAD tuning. Thanks for watching.